I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter T. Coleman. Dr. Coleman is professor of psychology and education at Columbia University, where he holds a joint appointment at the Earth Institute and Teachers College. He also directs the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, as well as the Institute for Psychological Science and Practice at Teachers College. He's also the executive director of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. A renowned expert on conflict resolution, Dr. Coleman's current research focuses on conflict intelligence, systemic wisdom, and meta-competencies for navigating conflict constructively across all levels. Dr. Coleman has authored over 100 articles and chapters, edited and written numerous books. He's a member of the United Nations Mediation Support Unit's Academic Advisory Council, and he's a founding board member of the Bowie Peace Foundation USA. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Coleman.
Good afternoon. So I am a researcher and academic, and I will speak today on the science of teamwork briefly. I want to start, though, with a story of a team that is a tremendous example of an extraordinary failure. It's a team that was responsible for something that took place 32 years ago at a nuclear power plant called Chernobyl, which some of you may be familiar with. This was the worst nuclear disaster in human history. It was a Category 7, which is the worst possible. There were 120,000 people that had to be evacuated from the area. For 9 days, the toxic waste from the explosion rose in the air and then was blown across Central and Southern Europe. There were somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 estimated deaths from this accident. And today, there are still 5 million people that live on highly contaminated land from this. So some of you are probably familiar with the Chernobyl disaster. What you may not know is that the team that was at the helm that day, was a team of engineers and scientists, were the best of the best. They were highly respected, really experienced, an award-winning team, and somehow they still managed to trigger one of the worst catastrophes in human history. So that may be surprising to you. None of them committed some kind of egregious technical problem. What happened was that the way the team functioned or the way the team malfunctioned ultimately was the primary driver behind the disaster. So in other words, the best possible team running a nuclear power plant failed fantastically. So the question is, how is that possible, right? So what I want to say is that the good news is that something over 100 years of systematic research on teams and groups have taught us a great deal about effective teamwork and how teams can avoid being derailed like that. The bad news is that I have 10 minutes to do this. So I can't possibly cover all that information. So what I've done for today is I've sort of cherry-picked the 5 most actionable insights that I think research can share with us to help us sort of frame our conversation. So shall we begin? All right. So number 1 is initial conditions matter. So researchers that study how teams evolve over time have found that new teams are very sensitive to how they begin. So that means that you can have 2 teams who start with very similar kind of starting conditions, but they may function in very different ways and ultimately end up in completely different places due to slight differences in how they begin. Scientists call this a sensitivity to initial conditions, right? Researchers that study IBM strategy teams find that early on in the life of these teams, they create kind of an emotional climate within their team, and teams create different emotional climates, and those things are very robust and resist change, and they oftentimes influence how the trajectory of the groups go forward. Same with at the organizational level. One of the things that researchers have found is that the founders of organizations, Henry Ford or George Eastman at Kodak or Anita Roddick at The Body Shop, that their personalities and their values oftentimes will shape the organizational culture. And that organizational culture will sometimes last decades, if not centuries, beyond the founder themselves. So the early initial conditions of how these groups and organizations are established are important. Now, there are a lot of technical reasons for it, sort of positive feedback loops and self-organizing team processes. But basically what happens is when you start a new team, the conditions that you set up create an environment that is supportive of behaviors that are consistent with how it was set up. And so they kind of self-perpetuate the same kind of dynamics, and slight differences between groups become amplified. So you see very different outcomes from groups that were even somewhat similar as they began. So the point of all this is this. I'm going to now talk about 4 other conditions that are important. And they're most important to introduce these conditions for effective teams at either the launch of a new team or at some turning point in the life of the team when you really sort of demarcate the importance of a new beginning, because that really sets up the conditions for how the teams will move forward. So lesson number 1 is initial conditions matter. Lesson number 2 is about cooperation. So Google, a couple of years ago, finished a multi-year study. They did a big, ambitious study on their high-functioning teams. They wanted to understand the sort of secrets to their highest functioning teams and groups there. They measured teams on all kinds of different dimensions. It was something called the Project Aristotle. It was done by their People Operations Department at Google. And they were hoping that they could come up with some kind of algorithm that would tell us what are the best possible mix of individuals to put in perfect teams in order to replicate high-functioning teams. So they worked on that for about 3 years, didn't find it, couldn't figure it out. There was nothing like that. What they did find were a few things. The most important was that what really mattered at Google was how teammates treated one another. Really, it was something that they call psychological safety. And psychological safety is really the belief that when you're working in a team, you can speak up and put out kind of outrageous ideas and not feel like you're going to be attacked by the members of your team. So psychological safety was highly correlated with their most functioning teams. However, it's one thing to know that, it's another thing to know how to establish psychological safety in teams. You can say to people, hey, we need you to listen to each other and respect each other and be sensitive to each other's feelings. But some industries, like Google, tend to attract a lot of engineers who got into engineering in the first place because they don't want to listen to other people's feelings and talk to them in sensitive ways. So Google was faced with this challenge: how do we therefore establish psychological safety? So the good news is that there has been decades of research on groups and teams that says one thing really matters in uniting a team and creating those kinds of conditions, and that is really shared cooperative goals. So my center at Columbia, the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, for decades have studied team dynamics and synthesized others' research. And we found that when you introduce cooperative tasks where people have to work together, when you introduce cooperative rewards and cooperative goals, and you start to unify teams, it does create this sort of sense of psychological safety. It also leads to better productivity, but also just better communication and trust and rapport amongst the team. So cooperation contributes to psychological safety, which contributes to more high-functioning teams. And yes, this is exactly what Mr. Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Sesame Street and your kindergarten teachers told you for years. Cooperation is good, right? Except there are times when cooperation can be too much, right? So too much cooperation in teams and groups can be dysfunctional and can lead to kind of pathologies in groups like groupthink, where groups aren't questioning each other carefully or critically, or just inertia, or what they call sub-optimization in groups, where the group itself becomes more important than the organization and they don't really pay attention to the goals of the organization. All of those are kind of cooperation pathologies. This, to some degree, is what happened at Chernobyl. You had a group that was highly confident in one another's, they'd won awards, they got cocky, and they started to cut corners and break the rules, and then no one else in the team stood up and said, hey, wait a minute, what are we doing, right? So it was something about that team functioning itself that really triggered and led to this disaster at Chernobyl. So effective teams need one critical thing: conflict. They need cooperation, but they also need conflict, differences of opinions and ideas and experience and attitudes and cultures clashing. Those things are useful. Now, conflict, of course, gets a bad reputation in teams and organizations because it oftentimes messes us up, right? Conflict can derail us and distract us, and it makes most of us really crazy anxious. But under the right conditions, conflict actually brings energy to a team and can bring focus to a team and really sort of motivate you. So the question is not whether conflict is good or bad for teams, it just is. The question is, what are the conditions under which conflict is actually useful for the team and functional in moving us forward? Think about it. Without conflict, we don't learn if there aren't clashing ideas. We don't innovate or create, or it won't lead to sort of progress in the social realm. We need conflict, but we need to be able to manage it effectively and constructively. And what is the major condition that leads to more constructive conflict in groups? Cooperation. Cooperation helps. If you have conflict in a cooperative context, you see more effective team dynamics. Why is that? Because human beings are emotional, and teams are made up of emotional human beings. When any of us are in conflict, it triggers in us some kind of anxiety or fear or concerns, right? So there is a profound emotional experience that we have in conflict in teams or outside of teams. But it's not just that we feel emotional, it's that our emotions affect how we perceive conflict, how we read it. So there's great research on different kinds of teams. Again, organizational work teams, marriages as teams, or teams and communities. And one of the things that they found is that what happens over time in your relationships at work, at home, is that you develop what we call a sort of reservoir of emotions, right? Many different kinds of encounters. You start to create a bank account, a reservoir for sort of positivity within a team or negativity within a team. And those things really influence how we see conflict, how we perceive it, and how we respond to it, right? So without some kind of emotional buffer of positivity in a team, trust and rapport and liking and things like that, then when there is a conflict, it stings and it can lead to more negative things. But if there is a sufficient positive buffer in your team, then when there is conflict, you learn from it. You make adjustments. Things get better through conflict if you have a sufficient emotional positivity. So what we find is that what's most important in teams, in effective teams, is the right ratio of positivity to negativity. You want teams that have a sufficient positive bank account. You want teams that are somewhere between 3.5 to 1 positive experiences to negative experiences. And those are identified as the most high-functioning teams. When there's a lot of positivity and occasionally conflict, and you bump into things but then sort of learn from that. John Gottman's research on marriage finds that the ratio is 5 positive experiences to 1 negative. That's something to take home tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is that in marriage you want to have a lot of positivity to every kind of negative encounter, right? And it makes sense because conflict and our emotions are not only psychological phenomena, but they affect us physiologically. In fact, there's good research on cooperative teams and bonding that it elicits in us a brain chemical called oxytocin. And this brain chemical is associated with things like empathy and generosity in teams, and in large amounts, orgasm, right? So there's even orgasm associated with extreme teamwork, right? So the point that I'm trying to make, and I probably should end on orgasm because that's usually the most effective, but I want to share one more learning from our research, which is partially captured by something Charles Darwin said. Darwin said that it's not the strongest of the species that survives or the most intelligent, but it's the one most responsive to change. And we found this. It's a truism that groups that aren't responsive to important changes in their host environment will fail. And there's a lot of evidence of that. In fact, Facebook is dealing with this in terms of the changing cybersecurity environment today. There has to be significant changes in response to that. So that is a truism that teams need to be responsive to change. However, the other finding from the Google study, which is important, is that the highest functioning teams involve people who found meaning in their work. They found that the things that they worked on were really centrally important to them and that they had an impact on them, right? Which makes sense that you want to have that kind of connection to your personal values in what you do at work. However, these two basic team functions, which is responding to changes in the environment in ways that fit, and holding on to a sense of integrity and purpose and meaning to yourself, sometimes are at odds with one another in a group. And either extreme of them, being buffeted and changing all the time in response to environmental changes, or getting stuck in some kind of dogmatic ideology about the one way to do your work, either thing can lead to a team demise, right? This is what I think we're seeing something of in the partisan politics in Washington, D.C. today. We see some politicians that really watch the polls, and they change their positions on very important issues just in response to changing trends. We see other politicians that get stuck in kind of a dogmatic point of view and are unresponsive to important changes in our environment. And of course, what we need is both. So the good news for our country is that it is established on many of these lessons. So our founders established the conditions for civil discourse and rule of law and the importance of constructive problem solving by our leaders in our government. Our Constitution begins with the premise that we are united as a people in service of trying to form a more perfect union. That's a perfect cooperative goal that we really sort of share fundamentally. And our motto, which is on your dollar bill if you haven't noticed, is something that says E pluribus unum. And in Latin that means out of many, one. And it emphasizes that in America in particular, our diversity, our difference is our strength. It's an extraordinary source of strength for creating a more perfect union. The challenges that we have, of course, are that we're emotional beings, and we see a lot of animosity and enmity around the other team right now in this country. That's part of what the divisions are. However, we also have a country with a long history of unity and compassion for our neighbors and caring, particularly under times of crisis. So there is a reservoir of positivity that we can tap into and build on in America. The biggest challenge, I think, will be for us as a country to learn to adapt to these more divisive trends that we're in the midst of in ways where we still hold a sense of integrity about what's really important to us and to our country as Americans. If we can manage those somehow optimally, I think that we can thrive as Team USA. Thank you.